Hello, dear viewers. Welcome back to Untold Real Stories, where we uncover the most incredible discoveries and dramatic tales that life has to offer. Today, I have an absolutely astonishing story for you about an ordinary man, a charity shop, and a purchase that would change everything. So, sit back, relax, and let me take you on this remarkable journey. John Thompson had never been one for antiques or treasure hunting. A 52-year-old mathematics teacher from Bristol, his life revolved around lesson plans, parent-teacher conferences, and the occasional pint at the Fox and Hound on Friday evenings. But on that unremarkable Thursday afternoon in October 2023, as autumn leaves scattered across Park Street, John made a decision that would change everything. His wedding anniversary was approaching, 25 years with Sarah, his wife since university days. He'd forgotten to order flowers, the restaurant was fully booked, and panic had begun to set in. Walking past the British Heart Foundation charity shop near his school, John noticed a handwritten sign in the window. New donations daily, treasures waiting to be found. The word treasures struck him as almost comically optimistic for a charity shop filled with donated clothing, chipped mugs, and outdated electronics. Still, Sarah had always loved vintage jewelry, wearing it with an ironic appreciation for old-fashioned glamour. Perhaps he could find something quirky, something with character that would show he'd put thought into his gift, even if he'd left it shamefully late. The shop smelled of mothballs and old books, with that peculiar mustiness that seems to inhabit all charity establishments. Behind the counter, an elderly volunteer named Margaret was sorting through a box of donated scarves, humming along to a radio playing classic FM. She glanced up as John entered, offering a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Looking for anything in particular, love?" she asked in a thick Bristol accent. "Just browsing," John replied, the universal response of the uncertain shopper. He wandered past racks of polyester shirts and shelves of romance novels with lurid covers, eventually finding himself before a small glass display case near the back wall. Inside, arranged on faded velvet, lay an assortment of jewelry that had clearly seen better days. Tarnished necklaces, broken watches, earrings missing their partners, and brooches that had once fastened coats long since discarded. One piece caught his eye immediately, not because it was beautiful, but because it was so utterly peculiar. A brooch, roughly circular, about the size of a £2 coin but thicker, almost chunky in its construction. The metal was dark, nearly black with tarnish, and encrusted with what appeared to be centuries of grime. Yet something about its weight, its presence, drew him closer. Set into the metal were several stones, at least John thought they were stones. They might have been coloured. Glass for all he could tell through the layers of dirt. The entire piece looked as though it had been buried in someone's garden for decades before being unceremoniously dug up and donated. "How much for this one?" John asked, pointing to the brooch. Margaret squinted through her reading glasses. "Oh, that old thing. Came in just yesterday with a whole box of bits and bobs from Mrs. Patterson. Poor dear, her aunt died last month. 97 she was, and the family's clearing out the house. Been in that family for generations, that place. Victorian Terrace over in Clifton." She consulted a tiny price tag barely visible beneath the brooch. £4, love. Bit of a funny piece, isn't it? Not really my cup of tea, but I suppose there's someone for everything. £4. John had spent more on his morning coffee. "I'll take it," he said, surprising himself with his certainty. Margaret wrapped it in tissue paper with the care one might give a Fabergé egg, placing it in a small. paper bag with the charity's logo printed on the side. As John handed over a £5 note and received his change, Margaret smiled warmly. "I'm sure your lady will love it, dear. It's got character, that piece. Real history to it, I'd imagine." If only she had known how right she was. That evening, John presented the brooch to Sarah with an apologetic smile and a story about vintage charm. His wife unwrapped the tissue paper, her expression shifting from anticipation to polite disappointment in the space of 3 seconds. "Oh," she said, holding the grimy object between thumb and forefinger as though it might be contaminated. "It's certainly old-looking." She turned it over in her hands, frowning at the encrusted dirt. "John, this is absolutely filthy. Where on earth did you find it?" When he admitted to the charity shop purchase, Sarah's disappointment deepened. £4? Darling, I appreciate the thought, truly, but this looks like something you dig up from the garden. I can't wear this. It's practically black with grime. She set it on the kitchen counter with a gentle finality that spoke volumes. Over dinner, a home-cooked meal that John prepared as penance for his lackluster gift, Sarah suggested he either return it or simply throw it away. "There's no point keeping it if I won't wear it," she reasoned. "And honestly, I'm not sure cleaning would help. It might just be cheap costume jewelry from the 1970s that's gone all tarnished." John nodded in agreement, though something in him resisted the idea of simply discarding the piece. It had cost only £4, yes, but there was something about it, an indefinable quality that had drawn his eye in that dusty shop. The brooch sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days, gathering new dust atop its ancient grime. Each morning, John would see it as he made his tea, and each morning he'd think about throwing it away. But he didn't. On the 3rd day, a Saturday morning when Sarah had gone to visit her sister in Bath, John picked up the brooch and studied it more carefully in the bright autumn sunlight streaming through the kitchen window. The metal, though blackened, had a certain weight to it, a density that cheap costume jewelry wouldn't possess. And those stones, barely visible through the accumulated dirt, seemed to catch the light in an interesting way. On impulse, John grabbed his coat and headed into the city centre. There was a small jewellery shop on Corn Street that he'd passed hundreds of times, Hartley & Sons, established 1889, according to the gold lettering on the window. He'd never had occasion to enter before, but surely they could clean the brooch. Perhaps restore it enough that Sarah might actually consider wearing it. At the very least, they could tell him if it was worth keeping, or if he should simply accept defeat and bin it. The bell above the door chimed as John entered. The shop's interior was all dark wood and soft lighting, display cases filled with engagement rings that cost more than John earned in a month. An older gentleman, presumably Mr. Hartley himself, looked up from a workbench where he'd been examining something through a jeweller's loupe. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of old Bristol money. "How may I help you?" John felt suddenly self-conscious, aware that his Saturday jeans and jumper were perhaps not the typical attire of Hartley & Sons clientele. "I was hoping you might clean something for me," he said, producing the brooch from his pocket. "It's quite dirty, and I'm not sure if it's worth the trouble, but I thought—" He trailed off as Mr. Hartley's expression changed. The jeweller had reached out to take the brooch, but his hand froze midway, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. "May I?" he asked, his tone suddenly very serious. John handed over the piece, watching as the jeweller carried it to his workbench and switched on a bright examination lamp. For a long moment, Mr. Hartley said nothing, turning the brooch over in his hands, studying it from every angle, occasionally bringing his loupe to his eye for a closer inspection. "Where did you get this?" The question came quietly, almost cautiously. "A charity shop," John admitted. "The British Heart Foundation on Park Street. £4. My wife thought it was rubbish, to be honest. Is it worth cleaning, or should I just throw it away?" Mr. Hartley looked up at him, and John was startled to see something like shock in the older man's face. "Throw it away? Mr. Thompson, John Thompson." "Mr. Thompson, I need you to understand something. I've been in this business for 43 years. My father was in it before me, and his father before him. In all that time, I have never, and I mean never, seen anything quite like this walk through my door." John's heart began to beat faster. "What do you mean? What is it?" The jeweler set down his loupe and gestured for John to come closer. "This. Metal, Mr. Thompson. It's not silver, as you might expect. It's not gold either, though there are gold elements in the inlay work here." He pointed to barely visible patterns beneath the grime. "This is bronze, very old bronze. And these stones," he indicated the dull, dirt-encrusted gems. "I would need to clean this properly to be certain, but I believe these are garnets. Natural garnets, not the synthetic varieties we see today." "Is it valuable?" John asked, his mouth suddenly dry. Mr. Hartley chose his words carefully. "Mr. Thompson, the craftsmanship on this piece, the materials, the style of the metalwork. If I'm correct, and I stress that I would need to clean this and conduct proper tests to be certain, this brooch is not Victorian. It's not Georgian. It's not even medieval." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I believe what you're holding is Roman. 1st or 2nd century AD, possibly a fibula, a kind of brooch used to fasten cloaks. They were common throughout the Roman Empire. But pieces in this condition, with the stones intact, Mr. Thompson, this could be extraordinarily valuable." The shop seemed to tilt slightly. John gripped the edge of the workbench. "Roman? But that's 2,000 years old. How could something like that end up in a charity shop?" "That," said Mr. Hartley, "is an excellent question. Britain was part of the Roman Empire from 43 AD to around 410 AD. Roman artifacts are found fairly regularly, in archaeological digs certainly, but also in gardens, fields, during construction work. It's entirely possible someone in the Patterson family, you said it came from a house clearance, found this decades ago, perhaps while gardening, and simply kept it without realizing what it was. Over generations, its origin was forgotten. It became just another piece of old jewelry in someone's collection." John felt lightheaded. "What should I do?" The jeweler considered. "First, I'd like your permission to clean it properly. Just a gentle cleaning to remove the surface dirt so we can see what we're really dealing with. Then, if it is what I think it is, you'll need to contact the Portable Antiquities Scheme. They're the government organization that records archaeological finds made by the public. If this is genuine Roman material and was found in England, there may be legal requirements around reporting it." "But I bought it," John said, suddenly worried. "It's mine, isn't it?" "Almost certainly, yes. The Portable Antiquities Scheme isn't about confiscating finds. It's about recording them for historical purposes. And if it wasn't found as part of a treasure hoard, if it was just a single item someone dug up years ago, then there's no question of ownership. It's yours." "But Mr. Thompson..." Mr. Hartley's eyes gleamed with excitement. "If this is authentic, you should also have it properly valued. For insurance purposes, if nothing else. John agreed to the cleaning, though his hands trembled as he signed the receipt. Mr. Hartley promised to call him within 2 days once he'd completed the initial conservation work. Those 2 days were among the longest of John's life. He told Sarah nothing, afraid to raise her hopes, or worse, to have his own hopes crushed if the brooch turned out to be worthless after all. He taught his classes on autopilot, his mind constantly drifting to that small piece of corroded metal sitting in Hartley and Sons. When the call finally came on Monday afternoon, John nearly dropped his phone. "Mr. Thompson, it's Geoffrey Hartley. Could you come to the shop this evening? I think you'll want to see this." The jeweller's voice carried a barely contained excitement that made John's stomach flutter with anticipation. He arrived at the shop at 5:30, just as Mr. Hartley was locking the door behind the last customer. The jeweller ushered him in with an urgency that bordered on theatrical, leading him to the workbench where, under the examination lamp, lay the brooch. Except it was no longer the grimy, blackened lump John had left there. The cleaning had revealed a piece of extraordinary beauty. The bronze had been restored to a warm, golden-brown patina, its surface decorated with intricate geometric patterns and flowing curves that spoke of master craftsmanship. The stones, 4 of them, set at cardinal points around the circular design, glowed with a deep blood-red richness that seemed to pulse in the lamplight. "My God," John whispered. "Garnets," Mr. Hartley confirmed. "Natural Bohemian garnets, if I'm not mistaken, highly prized in Roman times. And look here." He pointed to tiny inscriptions around the edge, barely visible even now. "These marks are consistent with Roman workshop signatures. This wasn't mass-produced, Mr. Thompson. This was made for someone wealthy. Someone important." John reached out with a trembling hand, touching the brooch with reverence. It was beautiful, breathtaking even, but more than that, it was ancient. This small object had existed for 2 millennia, had fastened the cloak of some Roman Briton whose name was lost to history, had survived the collapse of empires and the passage of countless generations. "What's it worth?" The question felt crass, but John had to know. Mr. Hartley pulled out a folder containing photographs and notes. "I've consulted with a colleague who specializes in antiquities. Discreetly, I assure you. Based on similar pieces that have come to auction in recent years, and accounting for the excellent condition, the quality of the garnets, and the evident craftsmanship," he paused, meeting John's eyes. "A conservative estimate would be £35,000 to £45,000. If it goes to a major auction house and attracts serious collectors, it could fetch considerably more, perhaps £60,000, or even £70,000. The number was so large it became almost meaningless. John had to sit down. £60,000. £70,000. He'd bought it for 4. "I need to tell my wife," he managed to say. "I rather think you do," Mr. Hartley agreed with a smile. "And Mr. Thompson, do be careful with it. You're carrying around more value than most people keep in their homes." That evening, when Sarah returned from work, John met her at the door with a bottle of wine and a strange expression that made her immediately suspicious. "What have you done?" she asked, half joking. "Remember that brooch?" he began. "The disgusting one I told you to throw away." "I didn't throw it away." "John, please tell me you didn't spend more money trying to fix it." "Sarah, sit down." The seriousness in his voice stopped her. She sat on the sofa, her briefcase still in her hand, watching as John carefully unwrapped the tissue paper Mr. Hartley had used to package the brooch. He placed it on the coffee table between them. In the lamplight of their sitting room, the garnets seemed to glow like embers. Sarah stared at it, her expression shifting from confusion to wonder. That's the same piece? It's Roman, Sarah. 1st or 2nd century. It's worth at least £35,000, possibly more. For a moment, his wife simply stared at him, her mouth slightly open. Then she began to laugh, not the polite chuckle of someone hearing a mildly amusing anecdote, but the slightly hysterical laughter of someone whose reality has just shifted sideways. "You bought a Roman artifact for £4 at a charity shop," she gasped between laughs. "I told you to throw it away. I told you it was rubbish." "I know," John said, starting to laugh himself. "I know you did." The next few weeks passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and barely suppressed excitement. John contacted the Portable Antiquities Scheme, as Mr. Hartley had advised. A fines liaison officer named Dr. Emily Chen came to their home, examined the brooch with the reverent care of someone who devoted her life to such objects, and confirmed what they already knew. It was genuine, Roman, and remarkable. "This is the sort of thing that should be in a museum," Dr. Chen said, photographing the brooch from every angle. "The quality is exceptional. It's quite possibly an import from Gaul, or even Rome itself, brought here by a wealthy merchant or military officer during the occupation." She explained the legal situation. Because the brooch wasn't made of precious metal, bronze doesn't qualify, and wasn't part of a hoard, it didn't fall under the Treasure Act. It was John's property, free and clear, to keep or sell as he wished. The Portable Antiquities Scheme would record it in their database, and several museums had already expressed interest in acquiring it, but the decision was entirely his. John and Sarah discussed it at length. £70,000 would pay off the mortgage with money left over. It would secure their retirement, fund the home renovations they'd been postponing for years, maybe even allow for that trip to New Zealand they'd always dreamed about. But John found himself hesitant. This object had survived 2,000 years. It had witnessed the rise and fall of Roman Britain, the arrival of the Saxons, the Norman conquest, the Wars of the Roses, the English Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars. It had passed through countless hands, each owner unaware of the treasure they possessed, until finally it had come to rest on a dusty shelf in a charity shop, priced at £4. In the end, they compromised. They would consign it to Sotheby's, who had expressed keen interest in including it in their next antiquities auction. But they would set a reserve price at the higher end of the valuation range. If it sold, wonderful. If not, perhaps it was meant to stay with them, a reminder that extraordinary things can hide in the most ordinary places. The auction took place on a rainy Tuesday in March 2024. John and Sarah sat in the Sotheby's sales room in London, surrounded by serious-looking people with auction paddles and expensive watches, when Lot 47, a fine Roman bronze fibula with garnet inlays, 1st to 2nd century AD, appeared on the screen. John's heart hammered so hard he thought everyone must hear it. The auctioneer, a distinguished woman with silver hair, began the bidding at £30,000. Within seconds, paddles were rising around the room. £35,000, £40,000, £45,000. The price climbed with terrifying speed. Phone bidders joined in. Someone in the back row, a stern man in a charcoal suit, seemed determined to acquire it. At £55,000, most bidders dropped out. At £60,000, only 3 remained. The man in the charcoal suit, a phone bidder, and an online bidder whose presence was indicated by a chime. £65,000, £68,000, £70,000. The charcoal suit dropped out with a shake of his head. Now it was just the phone bidder and the online bidder, invisible competitors fighting over a piece of ancient bronze. £72,000, £75,000, £76,000. The increments grew smaller as the price pushed beyond even the optimistic estimates. Finally, at £78,000, the phone bidder withdrew. Selling at £78,000 to the online bidder, the auctioneer announced, her gavel falling with a crisp crack. Lot 47, sold. After the buyer's premium and auction fees, John and Sarah would net approximately £67,000. They sat in stunned silence as the auction continued around them, neither quite able to process what had just happened. The £4 brooch had sold for nearly 20,000 times its charity shop price. Later, they learned the buyer was a private collector in Switzerland, a wealthy individual with a passion for Roman Britain, who intended to loan the piece to the British Museum for public display. The brooch would be seen by millions, studied by scholars, featured in exhibitions. It had been hidden for so long, and now it would finally receive the recognition it deserved. As for Margaret, the elderly volunteer at the British Heart Foundation shop, she read about the sale in the Bristol Post. The newspaper had somehow tracked down the story. Local teacher's £4 charity shop purchase sells for £78,000. And Margaret had nearly choked on her tea when she saw the photograph of the brooch alongside John's smiling face. She didn't regret pricing it at £4, though. The charity had made £4 it wouldn't have had otherwise, and besides, she reasoned, she'd never been much good with antiques. Who could have known? Mrs. Patterson, the woman who donated the box of her aunt's belongings, had a rather different reaction. When her daughter showed her the newspaper article, she went pale and sat down heavily on her sofa. "That was Aunt Helen's," she whispered. "It was in that box with her costume jewellery. She always kept it in her dresser drawer. I thought it was just old rubbish." Her daughter, trying to console her, pointed out that they'd never known its value, that Aunt Helen herself had likely never known, and that at 97, Helen had lived a full life without needing to sell any Roman artifacts. But Mrs. Patterson couldn't quite shake the feeling that she'd given away a fortune to a charity shop, even though, rationally, she knew you can't lose something you never knew you had. For John and Sarah Thompson, life changed in ways both large and small. The mortgage was paid off, the house was renovated, they booked tickets to New Zealand for the following year, but more than the money, something else shifted. John found himself looking differently at charity shops, at car boot sales, at the dusty corners of antique markets, not with the fever of a treasure hunter, but with the awareness that history is all around us, hiding in plain sight, waiting to be rediscovered. On their 26th wedding anniversary, John gave Sarah a proper gift, a delicate gold necklace from a proper jeweller, bought with a tiny fraction of the brooch money. But they both agreed, laughing over dinner at the restaurant they'd finally managed to book, that nothing would ever quite match the absurd, impossible, wonderful story of the £4 Roman treasure. It was the sort of thing that happens once in a lifetime, if you're extraordinarily lucky, if you happen to walk into the right charity shop on the right day, if you happen to notice one particular piece among all the donated debris of other people's lives. And sometimes, if you're very lucky indeed, you ignore your wife's advice not to throw it away. So there you have it, dear viewers, an incredible tale of luck, intuition, and the extraordinary treasures that can be hiding in the most ordinary places. Remember, the next time you walk past a charity shop or browse through a box of forgotten items, you might just be looking at something priceless. Thank you so much for watching Untold Real Stories. If you enjoyed this tale, please like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Until next time, keep your eyes open and never stop believing in the possibility of the extraordinary. Goodbye, and see you in the next story.